Well, thank you very much for coming. My name is Clockwork. To some of you, you know me as Dr. Rorshach. And it's very nice to meet you, and welcome to my panel. So, just to briefly go over what it is that I'm going to be covering in this. This is a very, very basic overlook of some psychological concepts in which I'm going to teach you to hopefully help you improve on your writing and your characters so that they're grounded more in reality and more along what actual psychology is, rather than fantastical versions that you usually see in Hollywood and different portrayals of how mental disorder is. So hopefully not only will this help bring about more realistic characters, but it'll help you be able to be inspired in order to create some unique characters of your own. So, without further ado, we want to begin. I'm going to go over a very brief history of psychology. Hey, look, I'm already boring everyone to death. We're having a history lesson. All right, just so you get an idea of how psychology is a constantly evolving subject. The roots of it started back in early as Greek times, but it never really became an actual science until around the 1800s. René Descartes is one of the first people to bring about some psychological concepts. He didn't actually bring psychology itself into a scientific standpoint, but he did bring about the concept of nature versus nurture. I'm sorry? Descartes. Thank you very much. René Descartes brought about the concept of nature versus nurture, which is different types of discipline. Afterwards, William Wundt released his book, Physiological Psychology, in 1874, and opened up the first psychology office in 1879, and for the record is considered to be the father of psychology, bringing about it for the first time as a scientific discipline. And we have, I'm trying to make this as quick as possible. In the mid-1800s, William James brought about functionalism. Instead of focusing on just a problem, talking about how it is that people and their behavior interact with their environment. We have Sigmund Freud, the ever-famous Sigmund Freud. Despite some of the controversial subjects that he brought to the forefront, some of his beliefs in psychology, he is, for all intents and purposes, one of a very huge contributor to modern psychology, actually bringing about the first parapsychological viewpoint to psychology. We have Pavlov and B.F. Skinner. Pavlov, of course, being known for his trading with the dogs and the bells in order to learn behaviors. And yeah, was it a metronome? Oh, that's interesting. Thank you very much. They had metronome and B.F. Skinner. Is anyone familiar with the Skinner box experiment? Yeah, they put mice in these boxes to use different forms of discipline or positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement to behaviors in order to make rats behave in specific ways. Like press a lever, you get a food pellet. You have to do certain tasks in a certain order in order for you to get another food pellet. Or for negative reinforcement, they shocked them. Then with Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, we moved on to a more humanistic style. There's many different schools of psychology as you go along, different types, which you don't really see much of that in modern psychology. What you see is all of these different viewpoints coming together to form a specific type of discipline that each psychologist is going to use all to their own. Rogers was actually famous for bringing about the concept of free will and self-determination, or really pushing those things forward. And Maslow was famous for his study about the hierarchy of needs. And boring history lesson is over. Now we're getting on to actual stuff. In order for us to understand how it is that we behave, we also need to understand the anatomy of the brain and how each individual part works to affect the body. We have the four different lobes, and and then we also have the limbic system here. There's also the brainstem, and the brainstem being the most ancient part, but there's not really a whole lot to cover with those, so I wanted to get the main parts here. The frontal lobe of the brain is responsible for reasoning, planning, parts of speech, movement, emotion, and problem solving. This is actually the portion of the brain that when you hear about lobotomies, where they jam a needle in your eye, this is the part where they're poking around in order to affect behavior. You have the parietal lobe, which is right here in the center, this pink bit, movement, orientation, recognition, and perception of stimuli, or the different sensations that you get from your environment. You have the occipital lobe in the very back, which is responsible for processing the visual information that you receive from your eyes. It goes directly from the retina to the optic nerve, goes around to the back of your head, the occipital lobe. Then you have the temporal lobe right there at the bottom that's responsible for auditory processing, memory, and speech. The reason why I want to tell you this is because damage to each one of these parts of the brain can affect how it is a person behaves. So for those writers and artists who want to portray somebody who might have suffered brain damage, depending on the part of the brain that was damaged, you can see different aspects of their personality or different aspects of their behavior and functionality being affected. Let me get to some of the interior bits, the one that's responsible for a lot of the processing of the data before it actually goes to the four individual lobes. You have the, right here in the back, it's not labeled, that little funky looking wrinkled thing right there at the bottom. It's round. That's the cerebellum. That's responsible for coordination of movement, posture, and balance. All of the movement is responsible with that one little bit right there. You have the thalamus right there in the center. That processes almost all of your sensory information that you get, eyes, ears, taste, touch, and sends it out to the four different lobes of the brain. You have the hypothalamus, which is responsible for homeostasis, which homeostasis is keeping the body at a certain temperature with certain functionality, basically keeping you healthy. It's also responsible for emotion, thirst, hunger, circadian rhythms, and the autonomic nervous system, which is the parts of the body that you don't have to regulate, like blinking, which now, because I mentioned it, all of you are going to be blinking on your own. Breathing, your heartbeat, all of that is responsible for the autonomic nervous system, which means that if you don't, you really don't want to have to consciously make an effort to make your heart beat. But for blinking, breathing, if you were to stop consciously doing that, you're not going to suffocate. And then we have that's actually about it for that. Now that we understand the history of psychology and we know the structure of the brain and how it is that each individual part works together in order to create a functional individual, we can learn about how it protects itself through defense mechanisms. Now, one thing I'm going to be pushing a lot with any of the further subject material you'll see here will be the DSM. The DSM is a Diagnostic and Systematic Manual of Mental Disorders. This is the book. Anyone who wants to learn more about psychology and to go and have something pretty straightforward in helping you learn and understand different disorders, I highly recommend you get it. The DSM-4 is not the current version. However, it's one of the ones that all the information is out there and easy to grab. The DSM-5 is the current version. It's available. You can get it in paperback for about $100 and something, but it's to writers and creators who like to go into this kind of thing, it's well worth the price, and it'll be around for years. So each defensive level of these different defensive mechanisms have different purposes and different strengths and cons to each one. The whole purpose of the defense mechanism is to, as you receive stress, either positive or negative, the body has to regulate it. and defense mechanisms are responsible for how it is that you handle it or how you respond to something or any sort of stress. The high adaptive, there's way too many for me to go over each individual one, but I'll briefly go over which each level means, how good it is, how bad it is. The high adaptive levels are the optimal levels. These are some of the best ways in order for you to cope with stress. Anticipation, affiliation, altruism, humor, sublimation, suppressing your memories in order to protect yourself by saying that bad thing didn't happen. We're gonna pretend it doesn't exist. It can resurface later, but for now, we're putting it away until the body can handle the stress. Compromise formation is more along the lines of handling your fears, handling your emotions. There's displacement, dissociation, intellectualism, isolation of effect, reaction formation, repression. Different ones, let's take displacement, for instance. Let's say you were to have a really bad day at work, and you come home and you take it out on the dog, or yell at a plant, or just yell in your car as you're driving home. That's displacement. You're taking your anger and pointing it to something else, or your stress and focusing on something else in order to help you cope. Certain situations it could be healthy, other situations it's not. A lot of these are not really labeled in any sort of way which is bad or good. It depends on how you use them. Anything good too much can be a bad thing. Anything bad can be a good thing depending on how you use it. Minor image distortion level, devaluation, idealization, omnipotence, that's a fun one. Devaluation, I'm sure everyone's heard it. I'm not pretty, I'm not funny, I'm not smart. Or idealization, which is pretty much the polar opposite of that. Anybody here perfect? I like you. All right, then major image distorting level. I think they switched it up to say minor so that people who raise their hands would feel better. But major image distorting level, fantasy in which somebody refuses to live in reality, adamantly refuses to accept the things the way that they are, and instead makes up their own version of it. Projective identification, splitting of self-image or the image of others, in which they see somebody, they know what you are, who you are, but that's not what they're going to call you. They're going to turn you into something else. So that's a fun one to play with. I want to look forward to seeing some of that. Action level, acting out, apathetic withdrawal, help rejecting, complaining. This is whining. Defensive deregulation, delusional projection. These are the fun ones. Delusional projection, psychotic denial, and psychotic distortion. When you throw the prefix of psychotic, it makes it a ton more interesting, doesn't it? Which I don't need to tell you what denial is. Everyone knows what denial is. Or no, you don't. You have no idea what denial is. Distortion is the same thing as some of the split or the projective projective identification, but instead of projecting a certain image, either an image of themselves onto somebody, distortion is where they don't really take from anything. They just twist you around into something else.
Or they start talking to a 3-foot-tall pink dragon named Billy that lives in the left boot.
Exactly. I'm sorry? He said that either that or you're going to meet a tiny 3-foot dragon named Billy that lives in your shoe. Don't talk bad about Billy. He's a nice guy.
Oh, he's great.
Yeah, he's great. All right? Anyone need any of this up any further? All right. Move on. Now that we've done how the body protects itself, this is what happens when it doesn't necessarily succeed. Or, depending on what the disorder is, you can be born with it, it can be hereditary, or you can also help cope with them. There are different types of categories of the disorder. They're not really broken down into specific types depending on good or bad. They're put together in these different categories based on how it affects you or what its effect is. There are a bunch of different categories according to the DSM-4. Developmental disorder, cognitive, mental disorders due to general medical condition. Touch briefly on that. When you're making a diagnosis according to the DSM, there are 5 axes in which you diagnose disorder. And I think it's either the second or the third one that relies on whether or not these mental disorders are based on health. Your health, your overall physical well-being can affect your psychology and your mentality. So, very good on that one. Substance disorders, alcohol, drugs. There's mood disorders, anxiety disorders, general anxiety disorder, people who have panic attacks, or random panic attacks at different moments. Somatoform disorders, factitious disorders, identity, sleep, impulse control, kleptomania being a really big impulse control disorder, which I'm pretty sure somebody's already stolen my shoes since I've come up here. All right, adjustment disorders and personality disorders. As you can see, there's just so much here that it's really hard to touch on and everything. I'm just kind of giving you a very brief rundown of these. Personality disorders is a really big one. There's actually a specific diagnostic criteria with the DSM that categorizes whether or not something is a personality disorder, and that information is available online through the DSM-4. So I highly recommend you go check that out. All right. Now, there are 2 disorders that occur frequently in some of the writing and some of the works that I've seen. And some people do a really good job in portraying these different disorders. Some people put a Hollywood-esque spin on what these disorders mean. So I want to give you the 2 biggest disorders I see in the fandom and in different works. And I want to tell you the exact diagnostic criteria according to the DSM-4, in order for you to understand what it is, what sort of behaviors lead to somebody being diagnosed with these disorders. Dissociative identity disorder, or split personality disorder. It used to be called multiple personality disorder, but it was changed. It's now dissociative identity disorder. It has to meet these criteria in order for you to be diagnosed with split personality disorder. It has to be a disruption of identity characterized by 2 or more distinct personalities, or 2 or more individuals inhabiting the same body. These distinct personalities take control frequently, rather than somebody saying they're one identity one day and then switching up, and there's no consistency. It constantly changes. These are specific identities that retake control, such as our Discord Who's fans, Jekyll and Hyde. Amnesia between personalities. Typically, the main personality has no idea about this other personality and what they're doing. They could slip over into this other person. When they come back, they have no idea what they did. They could wake up in another town and have no idea how in the world they got there. The other personalities can be aware of each other. There can be as many as, I think one of the largest numbers that I've seen a record for was 14 personalities inhabiting the same person. I'm pretty sure there's more, but it's one of the largest ones I've seen logged. Typically, people who suffer from this disorder, when you have this creation of a new personality, somebody's experienced something that's so stressful that they create a whole new personality to cope with this stressful situation. If somebody is a very timid person, a very shy, soft person who can't handle stressful situations well, they create a person who's they're very, very strong-willed. They're very, very arrogant. They're bullheaded. They can take on the stress head on without having to worry about the stress involved. Typically, that's not very healthy in the long run, because the split personality is very bullheaded, very arrogant, very angry, prone to violence in some cases. And the whole purpose of it is to just help out with a temporary problem. So when you're faced with that situation, you got to work, the treatment is in order for you to sublimate the two personalities back together. The disturbance is not a normal part of accepted cultural, religious, or social standards. Social standards being a big point here. Depending on where you are, there are certain behaviors that are expected of you depending on the region. There are also behaviors that are considered unhealthy. For instance, speaking in tongues. Here in this room, if somebody were to suddenly start spitting a bunch of gibberish and rolling around on the floor, that might be considered pretty normal. In the general working world, that would be frowned upon. That's the difference between social standards. And depending on where you are, that can be the difference between considering something a disorder or not. So depending on where you are, that's actually a very big influence onto whether or not something is categorized as a disorder. Causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. The disorder has to hurt the individual, not just personally. It also hurt them in their job to the point where they can't work, or their social. How do they socialize with people? How do they interact with people? If any of these things are significantly impaired, those are one of the criteria that meet what's considered a disorder. And the disturbance is not due to the effects of a substance. However, there are certain disorders that correlate with substance abuse, alcoholism, drug addiction, but for personality disorders like dissociative identity disorder, these ones are not the effect of drugs, alcohol, eating a bag of Smarties, drinking a whole case of Monster, which, due to the trash cans I've seen around BronyCon, I'm pretty sure there are people that aren't themselves right now. Then we have another really big one, post-traumatic stress disorder. I see a lot of post-apocalyptic, something or rather, works, creations, blogs, whatnot, that a person is suffering from a traumatic event. A lot of these are very simplistic. They respond very angrily to certain stressors. And yes, that is true, but there's a lot more to post-traumatic stress disorder than just angrily reacting or some big macho dude with a giant gun running up on a hill and shooting blindly into the air. There's a lot more to it. This is actually going to be one of the longest ones. These are the different criteria involved according to the DSM-V. This is one of the most current ones I've actually received. The individual was exposed to death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious violence, or any other actual or threatened violence. And these different methods, either direct exposure, which a person was directly involved with this, somebody came up to them, threatened them, said, if you don't give me that Pinkie Pie plushie, I'm going to stab you. Witnessing it, a lot of people think you have to be the one involved in order for you to experience post-traumatic stress disorder. That's not the case. Witnessing it, or in some cases just hearing about it enough in passing, can cause post-traumatic stress disorder. Or indirectly by learning of a close individual friend was exposed. If you care enough about somebody, you can experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder if you hear something very significantly bad happen to them. Repeated or, like I said earlier, repeated or extreme indirect exposure to adverse details of events, usually through work, people who clean up crime scenes, police officers, different high-stress jobs can bring about symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The traumatic event is persistently re-experienced in the following ways: recurrent involuntary and intrusive memories or flashbacks, traumatic nightmares, dissociative reactions, immense or prolonged distress after exposure to traumatic reminders, or this is where triggers come in, marked physiological reactivity after exposure to traumatic-related stimuli such as elevated heartbeat, shaking, difficulty or inability to breathe. Some of these can get very, very severe. Persistent effort to avoid distressing trauma-related stimuli or certain subject material related to something that they experienced. Trauma-related thoughts or feelings, trauma-related external reminders. May avoid these things at all costs. Sometimes this level of avoidance can hurt you. Even though what you're trying to do is prevent yourself from re-experiencing these things, sometimes you avoid something so much it actually causes you distress. Negative alterations in cognitions and mood that began or worsened after the traumatic event, such as inability to recall key events or amnesia, repression, persistent negative beliefs and expectations about oneself or the world, in which case you believe that everyone is just as bad as that one person who made fun of you back in elementary school. Persistent, distorted blame or self-others for causing a traumatic event. Why didn't you help me? You could have done something. Why were you out doing something else? You should have been there with me. Persistent, negative, trauma-related emotions. Markedly diminished interest in significant activities. People who experience post-traumatic stress disorder, when they come home, I'm using soldiers, for instance, as this one. When they come home and they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, imagine somebody that you've known all of your life and has very specific interests. They love to go out and watch the game every Sunday night, get all their friends together and watch the game. Suddenly, they're very much against anything related to sports. They don't want anything to do with their friends. They don't want anything to do with their past life. That's an example of disinterest in activities, and that's actually one of the first behaviors you might notice when you see somebody who's suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. Not them losing their minds and screaming, but you notice that everything that they once cared about, they suddenly don't care about anymore and are avoiding. Constricted affect, they're very closed in. They don't want to talk much. They don't express their emotions very well. Trauma-related alterations in reactivity that began or worsened after the event, or once again, your affect. Irritable or aggressive behavior, self-destructive or reckless behavior, like excess drinking or substance abuse. Hypervigilance. Some of you have actually noticed, I'm looking around here, and I'm seeing some of you are constantly turning your head, looking around, seeing what's going on in the room, keeping a note of who's entering and who's exiting. That's an example of hypervigilance, having to constantly be aware of your surroundings. Exaggerated startle response. Tap somebody on the shoulder and they punch you in the face. Problems in concentration. That's pretty much self-explanatory. And sleep disturbance. That once again loops back to nightmares, night terrors, or fear of sleeping in the first place. And the biggest one is that these symptoms have to persist more than 1 month in order for you to be diagnosed with these disorders. Now, we have covered the structure of the brain, the different defense mechanisms involved in protecting the brain, a brief fun, I don't care what you say, history lesson about psychology, and 2 of the biggest disorders that I've seen in the fandom. So, I know it's not... All right. Now we've covered some of the biggest stuff I can cover. Now we're going to move on to questions and answers. So we have a freestanding microphone back there. If I could, we can have a line put somewhere wherever's best for you. And anyone who has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. Just form a line over by this gentleman right here. Right over here in this aisle. Don't be shy. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions. Yep, right there. I do have one quick question for everyone here before he leaves. Is Professor Euponium in the house? Yes, he is. Where's he is? Where's he is? Is he in here? I wanted to thank him. All right. Whenever you're ready, we can start questions. I'll go find him. Oh, you don't have to worry about that. I'm not going to disturb him.
The information that you had up there, would it be possible to access those slides on your Tumblr or elsewhere?
Do you know about my Tumblr?
Yeah.
Yeah. my information. I'll actually post a link to download the PowerPoint on there. No problem. Next question.
From what you've seen of the show, which events do you think would cause psychological trauma, and to which characters, and what would their symptoms be?
That's a very interesting question, and that's really hard to say because a lot of people think it's a big thing about different stressors and things that people experience. Nobody's going to interpret the same situation the same way. Let's take Twilight Sparkle has a very healthy way of handling certain situations, except when it comes to her education, which that's very obvious. The same situations that she's exposed to, danger, like for instance dragons, Fluttershy can't handle that. It really depends on, and seeing vicious animals like a giant bear roaring at her doesn't scare Fluttershy at all. That would terrify anybody. It would terrify me. Even scared of a dragon, but not afraid of a grizzly bear. It really depends on the certain situation. If I were to pick a specific event, I would have to say that probably one of the most distressful events that I could see that would affect somebody psychologically will be when Twilight opened up the door in the Crystal Palace and saw Celestia reject her. It's not going to be a very serious one, but I do believe that that might have some consequences paranoia-wise. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry, I couldn't really think of a better answer than that. I'm sorry.
My question stems more from looking to do some storytelling.
Absolutely.
But if you have a character driven by his sort of quest for revenge, what sort of mental states might he exhibit on his...
On a quest for revenge?
Like, let's say he lost someone close to him.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is a big one. Depends on the relationship. You can explore pre-existing conditions, pre-existing mental disorders that could have been that led him on this particular quest for revenge. Or you can go with you can always go with a ninja, just nondescript quest for revenge for no particular reason. But yes, post-traumatic stress disorder would be a very good one to explore, or at least not a full-on diagnosis, but there might be certain symptoms that they may exhibit. So, thank you very much. I think the biggest one would be post-traumatic stress disorder. A lot of the way I've seen post-traumatic stress disorder portrayed is them becoming this big gung-ho hero who might have trouble sleeping every once in a while, but their whole disorder seems revolving around getting this specific non-specific revenge, or this lasts throughout their life where they want to find and hunt down this person. There are people I've seen, soldiers that have come home that I've met personally, that they will experience certain symptoms at their home, but the post-traumatic stress disorder that I've seen a lot in the fandom is very in your face. It's very much prevalent. It's obvious that this person is suffering. A lot of people suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, you don't see them. You don't know that they're going through something this horrible or this traumatic. I want to see more subtlety. I want to see more down, kind of keep it in close. This person's not going out screaming from the rooftops. They're at home in their room crying, not able to express themselves, but afraid to express themselves to others. And that's what I mean. Hollywood doesn't so much put a false spin on it, so much as they ramp it up to extremes that don't occur in normal society. So I want to see something more based in what you would actually encounter. So when you see somebody, a lot of people look to Hollywood and get certain ideas about how it is a person is supposed to behave. I want to see people, now that they're seeing what the disorder actually is, being able to notice the signs and giving people help that need it, that can't ask for it on their own.
So the disorders are often either over-dramatized or sort of the negative effects are downplayed, one of the two.
Yeah, their negative effects are downplayed in favor of certain other ones that play along with their story, and the other effects are way overhyped. That's my problem with it.
I was wondering if you've psychoanalyzed the ponies themselves, the main six.
The main six, no, I haven't really. Those of you familiar with Dr. Rorschach, I try to be involved. So if I find a really good Twilight cosplayer, I believe you can get in character. If I could do that with Tara Strong, that'd be really good. Or I actually want to interact with them one-on-one, because figuring somebody out is not just watching them, it's interacting with them. You can get a general idea of who they are, but until you're actually face-to-face asking the specific questions, you're not really going to notice all the little subtle cues. Yes, like I have done psych evaluations on a ton of characters. We're still doing psych evaluations of Discord Hooves. We're doing psych evals of the Master, Minuet. I've had fans come up, and I've done evaluations on their characters. It's as far as the main six, no, I haven't touched on that.
And would you say that Fluttershy suffers from PTSD?
I wouldn't say Fluttershy suffers from PTSD. I think Fluttershy would suffer from more along the lines of a general anxiety disorder. You're gonna love me. Oh, yes, go ahead.
My question is that my OC suffers from a phobia of flights and heights. She's a Pegasus. And recently in a role play, her friend didn't know this, and he took her up into the air and she fell off. And he caught her before she hit the ground.
Oh, that's lovely.
But when they landed on the ground, she was like just unresponsive, shaking, crying. And I wanted to know, is this a appropriate response for someone
Absolutely.
faced with their phobia?
I wouldn't react that way, and I'm not even that afraid of heights. But yes, sometimes sometimes somebody who's exposed to something as traumatic as that can just go on. I'm not sure if there's a psychological or a scientific documentation of this, but if I remember correctly, there might have been a case where somebody has actually dropped themselves into a coma, or at least comatose-like symptoms, or where they just drop everything. They blank.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, I wanted to know how some people with identity disorder, how do they communicate with their personalities?
With dissociative identity disorder?
Yeah.
So oftentimes they don't. The different personality, if a person has more than two personalities, they might interact with each other, or they might be aware of each other, but as far as interacting, I don't think they really do much in terms of reacting. The psychologist at that point would be really responsible for the interaction between them. It really would depend on the psychologist whether he would consider that to be healthy or not. I hope that answers your question. We don't talk about Fight Club. If you want to, you can just shout your question. I'll probably be able to answer. That's right.
So I was wondering just about the subject of amnesia in general, like when someone is traumatized into like forgetting specific events or forgetting like their entire life in some cases, like the like realistic, like what's like really like that, and what, you know, just more details about that sort of thing.
You know, there's actually a disorder called amnesic disorder, or where the person frequently forgets segments of their life. But as far as what you're talking about, that is a type of defense mechanism, repression. So forgetting their whole life, they must have had a really bad life. But there have been significant parts where somebody will forget something. As far as their whole life, that seems more like regression, not so much repression, where somebody will revert back to a childlike demeanor or behavior. Yes.
Okay. May I hold on to this? Okay. Well, in Wonderbolt's Academy, Rainbow Dash and Lightning Dust created the tornado in which the remaining 5 fell out of, and had to be saved by a condensed cloud. Do you feel that the seeing her friends fall from something that she helped create would be her biggest fear? Like what if they died from that fall?
That's actually very good. There could be effects of that, nightmares, anxiety, panic attacks. That's highly probable. You would just have to see where it goes from there, if they decide to utilize that or not. Thank you.
How do people with... It's for president, right? Nice rolls. Okay.
I just got con bombed by Cthulhu. Yes, please.
How do people with dissociative identity disorder generally feel about their other personality? Like, is there any anger, like, how dare you share my body, or is it like, they're okay?
It's very possible. Usually it's I would imagine confusion, because these people are not aware of these other personalities. They're not. You can tell them about them, but as far as they know, they black out. They have no idea. So imagine, for instance, you have trouble, as far as you know, you think you have trouble sleeping. You're up, and then all of a sudden you're waking up on your couch in your friend's house. You have no idea how you got there, in different locations that can't be explained rationally. You might think you sleepwalk or something like that. You're really not aware until somebody says, you turn into a go-go dancing superhero whenever you fall asleep. Imagine your response to that. As far as you know, you're fine, but you're really not. Thank you.
Basically, my question, it deals with one of my OCs, but the basic idea is which is stronger, like nature or nurture, like which makes a greater impact on someone?
A combination of both. In terms of the individual aspects, they both have pros and cons. When I say nature, that makes a person tougher, but they really don't know how to interact. They really have no affect towards other people. They don't really associate with other people. You just like taking a baby and dumping them in the woods and saying, here's a survival kit and a Band-Aid. Good luck. Well, as far as the most effective, you want to use a combination of both. In terms of which one is stronger, there's really not one that is stronger. It really depends on what you want to achieve with your characters. I think that would answer your question. Thank you.
I would just like to give a shout out to any other science bronies before I ask my questions.
Yes.
So if there are. So I actually have two questions. So would you prefer I ask them one after another or both at once?
However you want to do it.
Okay. So the first question I have is, you took a very much of a diagnosis standpoint on how you actually described different disorders, and you described a lot of some of the anatomy behind the human brain. Mm-hmm. My brother of mine is working a lot in cognitive neuroscience, and they're trying to draw together more of the cognitive elements of different personality disorders and to how people respond to them. Mm-hmm. So in your opinion, as a professional, do you find that this is an accurate way of describing this, and do you find this is more prevalent within the fandom, this one in particular, or just any other subcultures? And my second question, I believe, is somewhat tied to this.
I'll answer your first question
okay.
first. First of all, he thinks I'm a professional. Yes, but as that's a very good question. I really appreciate that. That's a really nice question. The way I tend to look at psychology is not whether or not I believe something is good or not. I haven't really reached a point I believe in my knowledge that I can say that I don't believe this, I believe this, and I refuse to acknowledge this. I believe the point where each individual stage is coming up between DSM-4 and DSM-5. I look at the changes between it, and I want to explore where it is that they went from this to this. So I'm pretty much right along with where I believe your brother is, and where I just want to explore and see where you draw these connections from and what led you to these points. If I believe that the way that you reach those points is acceptable, that there's plenty of studies to back up your findings, everything is cited properly, and I can look and I can see that there's no little hidden chapters and you're not just picking out little things in order to support your hypothesis, I'm all on board for it. And what's your second question?
My second question is, in the fandom, I've seen primarily two types of OCs. I've seen OCs that describe and are in many ways the internal personality of someone that they may be repressing in some manner because they have a stressful job and then they have time for themselves, so they draw their OC. So when they're in the ponyhood, they see who they are.
I don't want to interrupt you right there. I just want to say something real quick.
Yes.
That's actually a very healthy way of stress relief. So yeah, it's very good for you to mention that.
And then I've seen a second type of OC, which is very much an escapist OC, which is the complete diametric opposite of many people. Mm-hmm. And do you believe that, or do you suspect that people who have very escapist OCs, if that's a healthy way of dealing with stressors that they may have in their life, that actually go about creating and using that OC, whether it's role play or just merely my avatar on a board?
Absolutely, I consider that to be. I consider using art, music, and just doing something constructive with your stress is probably one of the most healthy ways to deal with a bad situation. I highly encourage it with creating. I've loved everything. I've seen The Escapist, and it really depends on how extreme that they go with these certain blogs and whatnot. As long as they're not dragging these things into reality or mimicking these behaviors as they're creating in their other atmospheres, then by all means, I would love to see some more blogs in which people pour themselves into, and I'm just looking forward to seeing what everyone is creating. And music therapy is an actual form of therapy. There's actually a website devoted entirely to it through the American Psychological Association. So yes, that's a very good question, and that's right. Thank you. Can I help you, Aaron?
Yes, so my question is about how Luna goes to Nightmare Moon. I'm writing a story about it, and we all know how that's going to end. And so I was wondering, it starts off as Nightmare Moon is just a voice in Luna's head who is egging her on, and Luna hates her and just wants her gone like a demon. Mm-hmm. But in her actual life, she's trying to help Celestia, but Celestia keeps rejecting her and telling her that she's breaking some rules that she's setting. And as the story goes along, she's starting to tolerate Nightmare Moon more as a voice. And so I'm wondering how much, in a combination with Nightmare Moon egging her on and Celestia putting her down, how much negative reinforcement from Celestia would it take for Luna to finally reject Celestia and adopt Nightmare Moon as a surrogate sister?
That really depends on how you're portraying Luna. Depends on her will. How strong is she?
She's trying, this is right after the Fall of Crystal Empire movie, and so she's trying really hard to help find it, but she's doing something that she shouldn't do, and so she's really strong-willed and it's really eager to help her, but Celestia says no.
You can go one of two ways with that. You can go to the point where she breaks, in which she's being put down, or to the point where she takes her beliefs and turns them to the point where she says, I'm doing what's best. A lot of people who've done bad things, they've done these bad things out of the belief that they're doing the best thing that they can possibly do, which doesn't require breaking down a character. It's just a change in morals. So where you go with that, it's really up to you. There are a multitude of options in which you can go with this. So if you're familiar with my Tumblr, The Clockwork Pony, when you finish with it, or when you finish your story, I would love for you to submit it to me so I can read it.
What's the Tumblr account again?
It's theclockworkpony.tumblr.com. All right. Thank you very much.
Do you think that unicorns or alicorns' magic would be affected by a mental disease?
Absolutely. Some people have actually asked me why, you see my character right here, Dr. Rorshach. Some people ask me why it is I didn't make him a unicorn. I said because I believe that using magic kind of takes away from the whole psychological aspect of it. I wanted to explore how an earth pony would go along treating people. And magic is very much based in their brain chemistry, their overall affect. So different disorders, I would imagine, would greatly affect the outcome of their, in certain situations, could greatly affect the outcome of their spells, or minutely affect it. It really depends on how it is that you want to roll with it and what the disorder in particular is. So yes, absolutely.
My question is, you know how they say that we have like a mammalian part of our brain and a reptilian part of our brain? I was wondering, like, if I had, two OCs, one was a mammal, one was a reptile, kind of getting this point across. What strengths and weaknesses to these disorders would the reptilian part of the brain have in contrast with the mammalian part of the brain? Like, would the mammalian part of the brain be, more resistant to one but more susceptible to the other, and vice versa?
I'm not familiar with that particular study about the brain, so I can't really answer that to the fullest, but I believe that what you're talking about might sound something, 7 minutes? Or 9 minutes, I'm sorry. 8 minutes. I can't count. But sorry, I'm going to have to speed this up as quick as I can. Sigmund Freud proposed the theory of the unconscious, which he used the id, the ego, and the superego, which now we are familiar with the conscious and the subconscious. He believed the id is responsible for basic desires, food. Well, for food and the very basic desires. The superego is responsible for your overall behavior, your personality, whatnot, and there's you, the ego. So I wouldn't say there's so much like a specific part of the brain related to a certain species, but there are different layers of consciousness that we don't know how deep they go, which can work along with what you're trying to accomplish. So hopefully that answers your question. I'm sorry.
First off, thanks for kind of explaining that PTSD is one of those things that you don't often see symptoms of. As a former military guy that suffers from it, I appreciate that.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
My question was specifically about, I have two actually, and the first one's really simple. Are you going to be hanging out anywhere in particular so we can chat more afterwards?
I'm going to hang outside the doors right over here for a little bit to take more questions for those who didn't get a chance to ask me. I'm usually going to be either downstairs at Jitter's helping out at his table, or I'm going to be over at Little Miss J's table helping out with him.
Okay.
So you find me in one of those 3 places.
Awesome. The second question I have is specifically related to the story, What Princesses Need, because I edit for some people that write stories with Luna in them, specifically post-banishment, after she comes back. Would she be classified as someone that has DID? That's something that's addressed kind of specifically in that story, What Princesses Need.
It's not really explored, at least I haven't seen it explored that much. So that would have to be something that would either you have to take some constructive liberties with, or you'll have to wait until they address it in the show. All right. Thank you very much.
Are you a writer yourself?
I'm sorry?
Are you a writer yourself, or do you just read generally the fan fictions?
I am a graduate. I didn't get a psychology degree. My college doesn't offer one. I've taken every form of psychology that my college offers. It might be a little creepy that I did.
Well, I mean, do you actually write fan fictions, or do you just read them?
I do write. I do create. Dr. Rorshach being my creation, and I do voice acting.
Okay, that leads me to my second question. Personally, I don't have a problem with the personality of my characters. I only write very cathartic things, short stories about, things that I've experienced in my life through either others or myself. Maybe like an alcoholic that I know, and I know what alcoholism is, so I write about it, stuff like that. When my question is regarding, let's say you're writing a story, and you realize that you have to do terrible things to that character, and you just can't, you mentally, it's starting to affect you because you don't want to do that. What's a good way to move beyond that and force yourself to kind of put them through their trials in order to get them to the end result?
You're looking at the act. You're looking at what the character is going to go through. The way I try to look at it is what they're gonna be when they come out. I like to put characters in a situation and let them do their own thing. If
there's a bad situation, just drop them in, let them go. Let the character, if you built a character enough, they will do everything for you. Drop them in the situation, see what comes out of it. If you like it, roll with it. If you don't, change it. Thank you.
All right. So I play one of those RPG games. Now my character, he used to be in the military, so he's got a strong sense of camaraderie. And then when he gets out, he ends up homeless and no money and descends into alcoholism. But eventually, two ponies let him come on an adventure with them. So he wants to repay these ponies for being his friends. So eventually, he goes into a bar, he starts a bar fight so he can steal like $1,000 bottle of wine. But he ends up failing. He like tramples a royal guard and loses hold of the bottle of wine and it shatters. So now he can't. This was his big plan to repay these ponies for their friendship, and it's extremely important to him. How could this affect his morale in the future?
In terms of short term, dismay, anger. It really depends on who your character is. Long-term effects, it really depends on how his friends rationalize it. If he were to confront his friends about it, how they react really dictates where it goes from there. So he needs to have a talk with his friends and not steal a $1,000 bottle of wine. Wine is gross. All right, I'll take 2 more questions.
Okay, maybe I was asleep at the beginning, didn't quite catch. What's your Tumblr for?
It's the Clockwork Pony.
The Clockwork
No
Pony.
spaces.
Okay. And what sort of further reading or supporting books would you recommend for those that are fan fiction writers for the psychology?
As far as learning about psychology, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Systematic Manual of Mental Disorders, it's one of the books. A lot of people might think it contains a whole bunch of jargon, but it's really straightforward and easy to grasp. So I highly recommend anyone who has any interest in psychology, please pick up this book. It's amazing. As far as just learning about a little something extra on the side for fun, read The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo in his study about the Stanford experiment. That's really interesting. All right. Thank you very much. Last question.
I have kind of a 2-part one. If a character is like in a war and loses a limb and has an artificial one attached, like a robotic limb, how exactly would the character be affected by that?
Explore phantom limb syndrome. That'll be interesting. An interesting thing to touch up on. It really depends. One thing, I get a lot of questions about how it is a character is going to react to something. I really need to know your character, and nobody knows your character better than you. So if you made a really good character, just like I said earlier, put them in the situation and see what they do. And if you don't really are unsatisfied, tweak some things around. Make it so that when you put the character in that situation, they react how you want to react. And sometimes when you do that, they might surprise you. All right. You have the second party question?
No, that answered both of them.
Okay, well, that concludes it here from me. If you want to ask some more questions, I'll be right out here in the hall over here. Thank you very much for coming.